Hello, everyone. Welcome to the April Layer 7 office hours. Ben Urbanski, product manager for Layer 7, is going to be presenting today on the API Gateway 11.1.2 release. I do want to let everyone know, if you've not attended before, you may not know, you are on mute. So you're hard muted throughout the presentation. However, if you have questions during the presentation, you can type your questions in the panel, and then we'll, of course, take some time at the end to try and go through all the questions. You will be unmuted at the end, so if you prefer to wait and ask your questions directly at the end, you can do that as well. And I just want to mention one more thing before we get started. In case you're not aware, there is a conference that's coming up. It's API Days in New York, and it will be on May 14th and 15th. We're inviting you. We'd love for you. We're going to be there. We would love for you to join us there. I'm going to be sending in the chat, if you want to look at it later in just a minute, I'm going to be sending to everyone a registration link. If you're interested in attending the conference, fill out this information. It's just a couple of fields in this registration link. Let us know, because we would be able to give you, as our customers, we would extend to you a free pass. And not only a free pass to the conference, but dinner with us. So we would extend an invitation to dinner with us as well. And let me take it a step further. If you are interested, because we will be presenting at the conference, if you're interested in presenting alongside us, like a 10 or 15-minute presentation on, how you're using the product and, the value that you have seen since you have started using our product, we would also comp or pay for your travel, which would include your hotel and the flight to come to the conference. So do be sure and register if you're interested. So I am going to stop here, stop talking, and turn it over to Ben.
Thanks, Pam, and good morning, everybody. Let's go ahead and get started. So as Pam said, today's office hour is going to be about our recent 11.1.2 release of the API Gateway. We might mention a few futures in here, so we start with this disclaimer. It's just to say that though we got a great track record of delivering lots of stuff and on time, that we can't guarantee any futures we mention we'll deliver on time or at all. And this is what we're going to cover today. We're going to start with enhancements and new features in this release. Then we'll talk about different libraries that were upgraded and any implications. We've got one deprecation announcement, and then we'll discuss the upgrade path from previous versions to 11.1.2. Long list of enhancements and new features, so we'll just dive right in, beginning with some OpenTelemetry enhancements. So if you're not familiar with OpenTelemetry, it's a relatively new preview feature that we introduced for observability using the OpenTelemetry standard and the ability of the gateway to emit metrics, traces, and logs that can then be correlated on back-end OpenTelemetry compatible systems like the Grafana LGTM stack or the ELK stack or many other vendor tools out there that now support OpenTelemetry. It's one of the preview features that has received some of the most interest from many of our partners and customers. Many of them are already using it. Some of them have already been submitting enhancement requests. These are a handful of requests submitted by one such customer, including custom attributes for metrics, traces, and spans, support for baggage, an enhancement to how we display span status and traces, and then some enhancements related to identifying attributes. So to begin with, custom attributes for metrics, traces, and spans. Why is that important to customers? It allows them to attach their own meaning to metrics, traces, and spans to also make them easier to search, filter, sort, and present in those back-end OpenTelemetry compatible systems. We are supporting now custom attributes for all of service metrics, traces, and spans, both globally and locally in policy. So beginning with service metrics, which are the metrics related to service, min, max, and average response times, total number of counts, the same service metrics you would normally see in the policy manager dashboard, and not to be confused with custom metrics that you can emit from policy using the telemetry metric assertion, which has its own support for custom attributes of those metrics. Globally, you can set what attributes you want to attach to your service metrics using a cluster-wide property. And then if you want to override those on a per service basis, you can also do that locally in policy by setting a context variable. We're following the same pattern for traces and to a lesser degree spans. So traces or server kind spans, of which there's only one in the trace that represents the service itself. And then you would see additional spans in that trace that would be internal kind spans that represent each unfiltered assertion in the policy of the service that's being traced. So for traces, you can set global custom attributes using, again, a cluster-wide property. And again, if you want to override those on a per service basis, you can do that locally in policy using a context variable. Spans in a trace then refer to spans per unfiltered assertion. So you could trace every assertion in the policy of a service, or you could trace just certain assertions. Any assertions that generate a span can have custom attributes attached to them using a context variable in policy. When you set that context variable in policy, it will set the custom attributes for any of the assertions that follow it in policy. So you could set different custom attributes per assertion, and then you can stop setting custom attributes for assertions further down in policy by just setting that context variable to empty. Again, local context variables that set custom attributes override the global cluster-wide property. Some more specifics, these context variables take a comma delimited list of key value pairs. The keys should be in plain text, but the value can be either in plain text or it can be a context variable reference. The delimiters, question marks, commas and equal signs should not be used in the key names or values, because when we dereference those context variables, if they contain delimiters, then it'll break the delimited string of key value pairs when we go to apply them in policy. In most cases, we'll just drop invalid attributes after attempting to resolve them. The local in policy service metrics custom attributes is implemented a little bit differently. It actually gets resolved all together as a string. If you are using those delimitators incorrectly, you'll get an error instead. We have a new cluster-wide property to attach a prefix to all of those custom attributes. And that is separate now from a previous custom cluster-wide property that allowed you to set a prefix for service metrics. Now, because there's context variable resolution involved with this feature, we recommend that you do not set the template.strict-mode cluster-wide property to true. If that's set to true, and we try to resolve a context variable reference for a context variable that doesn't exist, it results in a policy failure. That's false by default. Most of our customers leave that value as false, so it's probably not something most of you need to be concerned with. If you have set it to true, then you need to pay even closer attention to how you're using context variables for these custom attributes and what the value, and you would need to make sure that they do exist at runtime when they get resolved. If you want to troubleshoot this feature and adding custom attributes to your service metrics, traces, and spans globally or locally, you can do that by increasing the log level to find, and you will see log events describing the underlying behavior as we try to attach these attributes to those things. The next OpenTelemetry enhancement was for baggage support. Baggage is actually not an OpenTelemetry concept specifically. It's introduced by W3C, but OpenTelemetry does have a more strict interpretation of it, and we're using OpenTelemetry libraries to handle baggage, and which are essentially key value pairs that are sent in a baggage HTTP header to allow multiple hops in a end-to-end transaction to communicate information between each other using that header. So we make it easier to read and write baggage in policy. And again, we're using a context variable paradigm for this too, just to keep things simple, not introduce new assertions where we didn't feel they were necessary. So in policy, you will now have a new context variable, hotel.baggage.keys, which will give you a comma separated list of baggage keys that exist in the header. You can get the value of a specific key by using an hotel.baggage.key name context variable. And then you can add and update new key value pairs to baggage before routing an outbound HTTP request using an hotel.baggage.update context variable, or you can remove existing keys from baggage before routing via outbound HTTP by using an hotel.baggage.delete context variable. Now, one common use case for baggage with OpenTelemetry is to add the baggage received at a hop to traces that are emitted by that hop. And so we make it easy to automatically add specific baggage key value pairs as attributes to your trace globally using a cluster-wide property or locally using a context variable. Again, we recommend not using these capabilities together with template.strict mode cluster-wide property set to true. The next OpenTelemetry enhancement related to span status enhancement. Our initial preview release of OpenTelemetry actually would report certain assertion spans as having executed successfully when we assumed that a failure of those types of assertions was expected. So for example, if you wrapped assertions in some conditional logic with at least one must, evaluate to true, for example, we might not show how some of the assertions below it fail because we think you expect them to fail. So we wanted to declutter that trace. However, what we and customers have found is that's made it more difficult to interpret that trace when most of our customers are used to looking for and even seeing expected failures in their policy. So now we're taking a very purist approach. Whenever an assertion in policy fails, whether it's expected to fail or not based upon the logic of the policy, that assertion's span will have an error status so it shows up red in your trace. We will only show the one server kind span that represents the entire service transaction as having failed if the policy fails and results in returning a failed response from the gateway. We also added a couple enhancements for identifying attributes. One was a way to configure a custom trace name using a cluster-wide property where you configure tracing. This will take a pattern like you see in the screenshot in the upper right-hand corner that can also have context variables, allowing you to give custom names to your traces. Note, if you do deploy the optional agent, OpenTelemetry agent, with your gateways, and depending on how you've configured it to automatically instrument more of the gateway tech stack outside of the gateway's use of the SDK specifically, it might wrap your traces with additional parent spans. We have no control over those. That's happening automatically from the agent. So you'll notice in that second screenshot, we are applying the custom name to the one server kind span emitted by the gateway, and in this case, it's called REST API 1. It's the name of the service by default. But in this instance where the agent was deployed, it wrapped our trace with an additional parent span that's simply providing the HTTP method and a / URI, making it less identifiable. Again, that happens automatically because of the optional OpenTelemetry agent and how it was configured when it was deployed with the gateway in this case. Just be aware of that. You have control over that. By default, we don't require you to deploy the agent to use OpenTelemetry with the gateway for service metrics, traces, and logs. You can choose to get even more information, but then this is one of those things that you might see if you do. There's also support for the OTel resource attributes and environment variable defined by OpenTelemetry, where you can statically specify additional custom attributes that will get attached as resource attributes to traces, and in some cases, other telemetry. So those were all the enhancements related to OpenTelemetry. We also have some enhancements related to Graphman in this release too. Graphman was one of our very first preview features. It was one that also received a lot of interest. It's one we started using as being the go-to gateway management API for building new functionality on top of ourselves. And many customers have, migrated to using Graphman just because it's more flexible, more capable, solves a lot of problems that we wanted to solve with RESTman. And so Graphman also was one of the first preview features that got advanced to GA in a previous release. We're looking at OpenTelemetry as probably being the next progressive delivery feature like that, based upon the amount of interest it's received. So it's definitely on the fast track to going GA sometime in the future. For Graphman, we've introduced these 3 enhancements. So the first one is partial updates. Normally, if you wanted to update the properties of an entity with Graphman, you would first need to get the full definition of that entity, change the value of the property you want to update, and post it back with the full definition. So that usually meant one call to get the definition that then you would make a change to so that you could post back your change. We've had some customers ask to be able to just do partial updates to properties of entities. So in a single call, they can change that one property to what they want it to be without having to first get the full definition and resend the full definition. So we've introduced 2 new mutations for 3 specific entities where we first wanted to introduce this capability. If we just look at the first one, the service entity, for example, you'll see we've introduced an update service mutation and an update service properties mutation. What's the difference between them? Update service will let you do partial updates of any property of a service. But for complex properties like the array of service properties themselves, if you look in this service properties dialog in the lower right-hand corner, what we're talking about when we say service properties in that context are these additional properties that can be added to a service. With the update service, you have to send all of them together. With the update service properties mutation, now you're working with just those additional properties of a service, and you can, you're able to then just do create, read, update, delete on them more specifically. And that logic carries through from service entities to listen to port entities to JDBC connection entities. So again, for the update entity mutation, complex types, and partial updates will overwrite, not merge. But for the update entity name properties mutation, you've got more flexibility to do add updates and removes with a single call. The next Graphman enhancement is related to folder deletion. So up until this release, we would not delete empty folders, and there wasn't a way to specifically delete a folder. Now we've introduced some folder deletion capabilities to make managing folders directly easier. So now when you delete services or policies within a, or even folders within a folder, you're able to include a force delete. Well, I'm sorry. You were able to delete folders before, but you couldn't delete folders that still had child elements within them. You would just get an error, and there was no way to force the deletion of that parent folder. Now, with this release, when you go to delete a folder, if it still has folders, services, or policies in it, you can force delete it by adding that query parameter and setting it to true. We also will automatically delete empty parent folders if you use the delete empty parent folder query parameter. Previously, even if you deleted the last folder service policy within a folder, it would leave the folder. Now you have a chance to remove that folder. And then the last Graphman enhancement was support for FIPS compliance when encrypting, and then on the Graphman API side, decrypting sensitive data. So we have provided a way to encrypt sensitive data using a specific algorithm before. Now we've enhanced that to include a FIPS compliant algorithm. Graphman will handle either interchangeably when it comes to decryption. So there's backwards compatibility for that. Next, enhancement to, or new feature to the gateway is the ability to configure your default ciphers globally. So in recent releases, we've removed less secure ciphers from the default cipher list. When doing that, we left users ways to add them back at the listener level or the route assertion level in policy. However, primarily for route assertions in policy, where you might be, you might have, hundreds of instances of those, we've had customers ask for a way to do that globally. So in a previous release that was first released as a hotfix, we introduced a single cluster-wide property that allowed you to set a default cipher suite for both inbound and outbound. In this release, where we've productized this feature, we've introduced two cluster-wide properties separating inbound from outbound decipher, default cipher suites. These are the places in the gateway configuration that are affected by both. You should specify your default ciphers with a comma separated list. Only the values shown in the UI are allowed. Unfortunately, you're not able to copy them from there to create your comma separated list of the defaults you want, but we provide a link here, or you can just find it in the JDK, a list of ciphers in the formats that are required to be added in a comma separated list to these cluster-wide properties. If you specify any invalid values, they're just ignored. If there's no valid values left in these cluster-wide properties, then we fall back on the hard-coded default set of most secure ciphers. If you have different of these configured, this is the order of precedence that the gateway evaluates them to. First, if you already have a custom list persisted to the database, like our default listeners do when first deploying a gateway, then that list that's been persisted to the database will take precedence and no default will be applied. Otherwise, if you're using either of these two inbound or outbound cluster-wide properties, they will take precedence. If you're a customer that received a hotfix for this before and you're already using the default, the single property for both inbound and outbound, and have not set either the inbound or outbound cluster-wide properties, then that single cluster-wide property will take precedence. If you haven't configured any of these things, then the gateway falls back on its hard-coded list of most default secure ciphers. Also in this release, we added new, stronger ciphers, specifically these three. They are not selected by default. Also in this release, we enhanced our non-blocking IO. We went from NIO to NIO2. Several releases ago, we went from blocking IO to non-blocking IO because there were performance improvements to be had. However, it did introduce a problem that some customers ran into that required them to configure a new cluster-wide property we introduced, tomcat.nio.polar thread count, and optimize that based on their concurrency to resolve the issues they were having. We started to explore NIO2 as a replacement for NIO, and we found that not only did it resolve that problem so that optimization using that cluster-wide property is no longer necessary, but it also rather significantly improved performance across the board. So we're getting a performance improvement from this as well. We also introduced an enhancement that adds more specific audit codes to CORE's log events. Previously, we were using rather generic audit codes, -3 for fine, -5 for warning, that get used in many other cases where there isn't a more specific audit code. That made it hard to primarily filter out CORE's records, log records and audit records from your logs and audits, which some customers wanted to do because based upon their policies and CORE's failures, their logs and audits were getting flooded by those records and they were not of interest to them. So by providing more specific audit codes, now you can leverage our standard logging and auditing configuration to suppress those if you want to. We also made an enhancement to HTTP strict transport security header support headers. These are a relatively common requirement used to tell browsers that they should only use HTTPS when communicating to an endpoint. In fact, it's actually required by our federal customers. It also something that gets flagged by certain industry standard security scans. When they scan ports, they look for those headers, and if they're not found, you get a scan violation. We've addressed this as much as possible with a policy-driven approach that we've documented with a knowledge base article. However, that required policy changes to implement, and it didn't work at all for the gateway's internal services. So the gateway's ping service is an example of one of those. And in fact, sometimes it's that very ping service that gets caught in security scans because it wouldn't be returning a HSTS header. We've introduced 2 new properties to give you more control over that at a global level. We've introduced a cluster-wide property that is global, and a listener property that is global at a listener level and can override the cluster-wide property. You'll see a list of acceptable formats for the values of both of those properties. Now, Both of those properties will get ignored if the backend returns an HSTS response header. So we will not override a backend HSTS response header that would normally get passed through the gateway. Using these properties, you could still do that in policy using policy assertions. Next enhancement was related to Kerberos. Frankly, this came out of our recent go to reduce operational risk by updating operational risk and vulnerabilities by upgrading library versions, even if they, we weren't otherwise required to upgrade them to address significant vulnerabilities. By doing this for the libraries we were using for Kerberos and introducing Apache Kirby library as an alternative, we were able to remove many additional libraries that were dependencies of the previous library. That resulted in a significant reduction of operational risk and vulnerabilities, but also some enhancements. We got 5 additional key tab encryption types based upon customer demand. We also introduced support for another utility for creating key tab files in the first place, one that was allowed them greater flexibility and would allow them to create key tab files from the gateway itself and not having to be on the Kerberos server to create the TCAB file. And we even introduced experimental at this time support for using Graphman to manage Kerberos configuration, which would allow you to fully automate Kerberos configuration, part of which is a manual process today, requiring some configuration through Policy Manager. We did introduce support for ICAP over TLS, and that changed the configuration UI of our existing ICAP assertion in the ways described here. I will say we are going to come out with a known issue recommending customers that are using ICAP stay on 11.1.1 for now. We recently found an issue with the changes we made for supporting ICAP-S in the 11.1.2 release, and we would discourage you from upgrading to 11.1.2 if you're using ICAP because of that issue. Once we have a fix for it, you could upgrade. We could provide you with a hot fix. Otherwise, we'll introduce the fix in our next minor release. We also added support for headless configuration of Luna HSM integrations with the gateway. So up until now, configuring Luna HSM integrations with the gateway did require a manual step using Policy Manager. Now with 11.1.2, you can fully automate that process. I'm not going to go into the details here because they are well documented, but they essentially follow the existing process and just replace the Policy Manager step with some automated options. Note that if you're trying to integrate Luna HSM with the container gateway, we've long required creating a derived image of the container gateway that has the Luna HSM client already installed in it, and there's an example for how to do that in our Layer 7 community repo. We did update the community repo README with additional documentation to support the automated configuration of Luna HSM integration for the container gateway too. We also introduced a new return SFTP response assertion. This assertion allows you to return a response from the gateway to the SFTP client early in policy, even before the whole file is transmitted from the gateway to the backend. This is useful for customers who have, need to transmit large files over slow networks on the backside of the gateway, which can take a lot of time and would otherwise have problems with clients timing, either waiting a long time for that to complete or timing out before it completed. Now with this assertion, you can add it to policy and it will return an early response to the client once the gateway has received the entire file from the client and before the gateway has completely transmitted the entire file to the backend. This only works for SFTP puts. You do have to make sure that the forward SFTP partial updates to policy checkbox in the listener is unchecked. Then you should use this assertion before your SFTP route assertion in policy. And then in this assertion, you can control what the response code will be. And it can be any integer between 0 and 31. Now, there's some things to be aware of with this assertion. First of all, if you're not streaming your SFTP, your file through the gateway via SFTP, which must be configured specifically, then the gateway is going to want to receive the full file, and it will try to buffer the full file before it starts sending it to the backend. I'm sorry, I got some construction going on. I'm guessing you're hearing that in the background. Pam, you want to let me know if that's going to be a problem for us?
We can hear it, but we can also hear you. So I would just say keep going. Fine.
Can you still hear me okay, Pam?
Yeah, I do still hear you. So it's
if
okay.
you can still hear me, I'm just going to power through, but it's really
Okay.
loud.
Power through.
Okay, I apologize, everybody. So first of all, you also need to set this listener port property for this behavior, for this assertion to work in policy. Enable early response mode to true. And then there is another listener port property, eager max write buffer size, which by default has a value of 1 megabyte, which will stop reading the file being sent to the gateway once the buffer has hit 1 megabyte. And so this is to help avoid a scenario where the gateway would run out of memory. Though you can set that to a value of -1, in which case there'll be no limit to the buffer. If you do that, beware, depending on the size of your files and the number of your requests and the memory available to your gateway, you might be creating a scenario to run out of memory. If you do use this max write buffer size, where you cap the size of a file that will buffer in memory on the gateway, then you should use streaming by using the configure message streaming assertion and policy, so that the gateway can start streaming that file to the backend as soon as it starts receiving it. And then that will allow it to begin to empty that buffer so that it can continue to read more of the file from the front end, even while it's streaming it to the backend. If you have a buffer limit and you hit the buffer limit, but you're not streaming, then that is another scenario where you could create an out of memory situation. If you're sending many requests that are filling that buffer and the clients are not timing out quickly enough, right? So a couple scenarios in which you can create out of memory situations if you use this capability. So be aware of that and use it wisely. We also enhanced our auditing of admin actions in the gateway to include audit records now when users and groups are assigned to roles. That was something that we weren't doing before. Now we're doing that if assigning users and groups to roles or roles to users and groups in Policy Manager. You will now see audit records detailing which user was assigned to which role. Now, because of the way that's implemented, it only does that today if you're making those assignments with Policy Manager. It will not create those audit records if you're automating those assignments using RESTman or Graphman. We do have a plan to address that in the context of our PM2 project. If you're not aware of that, that's our project to replace Policy Manager with a new web-based UI for connecting to your gateways and managing their configuration. We did implement an enhancement to increase the in-memory counter size for service metrics. So this isn't related to the size of a column in the database tracking that same information, but rather how that information gets tracked in memory before it's synchronized with the database. Previously, we were using a int variable to track those counters in memory. We actually had a customer hit the maximum value of an integer for their counters that had a month duration, and that caused some problems with how total counts for services were presented in the policy manager dashboard. We've increased that from an int to a big int, so from 32 bits to 64 bits. That should buy everybody a lot of time. And the way that will work then for customers that may have already hit that is once they upgrade to this version in which we made that change, then we will correct the value seen in the policy dashboard to be the max value of an integer, which is the closest value to the count they could have had when they went over that. We felt that was better than just resetting it to 0, which takes them further away from the count they would have had. We also went from RHEL UBI 9 minimal to RHEL UBI 9 micro for our container gateway. In this release, that's part of a continuing effort to reduce the size of the container gateway and the vulnerabilities found in the container gateway by reducing the number of packages automatically included with the container gateway. You can see here we made significant strides with regards to both size and vulnerabilities by just moving to the micro base image. We also took this opportunity to change the way we build our image. Before, we would collapse the entire gateway into a single image layer. We've gone back to a more industry norm way of having multiple layers represent our container gateway. And the advantages of that then can be that those layers can be downloaded in parallel, so it can speed up the polling of our large container gateway image, but they also can be updated individually. So when you go to move to a later version of the image, you'll only need to poll the layers that have changed. When a layer hasn't changed, you won't need to poll those layers. And then there's less redundancy across our layers of capabilities, so there's a cleaner separation between layers. Now, I'll say this is just one step in these directions, but we've got, we've wanted to for a long time, and now we have a mandate to move to distruless. So we're actively in the process of engineering our distruless gateway. Well, we are in certain ways. We'll begin that effort in earnest in our next PI, targeting the next minor and major releases of the gateway, 11.1.3, which is coming out in September, and 11.2, which is coming out in October, of course, subject to change. So this is just a step in that direction. We plan to go distruless soon. Now we get to some library upgrades and some of the implications of them. We did upgrade the MySQL connector that's included with the gateway, allowing the gateway to connect to MySQL to the 8.4 version so that customers could upgrade external MySQL instances from 8.0 to 8.4 early if they want to. We will be upgrading MySQL Server that's included in our appliance gateways to 8.4 in the 11.2 release, again, planned for October. We did verify backwards compatibility of this MySQL 8.4 connector with 8.0. So customers that are using our appliance gateways will still be able to connect to the 8.0, the MySQL 8.0 database that those are hosting. or customers that are already connecting to an external MySQL 8.0 database and don't want to upgrade to 8.4 can continue to do that using this 8.4 connector. We actually have to consider this. We did plan to upgrade the Enshield HSM client to 13.6.8. I'd have to double check. We might have pulled that in the last minute, to be honest, and I didn't update this slide. That would have been just in an effort, a continuing effort to reduce vulnerabilities that were found in that HSM client, and that were supposed to be addressed in later releases. I believe that what we found when scanning 13.6.8 is that while it fixed some vulnerabilities in a previous release that we were tracking, it introduced even more, and so we actually considered it a greater risk. So we might have held that back from our 11.1.2 release ourselves. You still can get an upgrade for it if you want from us. If you're a hardware appliance customer, of which we have very few, you would get it from us. You otherwise can get later versions yourself directly from Entrust and install them with your software gateways. In the future, especially as our hardware appliances go end of life, which is something we've already announced with 11.1 being the last major release that will support them, we're going to require that we're not going to ship Enshield HSM client with our gateways anymore. We're going to always require you to go to the vendor to get the latest version. We did do a minor upgrade of the JDK to 17.0.14 in this release. That JDK version disabled some Cipher suites by default. When the JDK does that, it usually disables them explicitly in the java.security file that comes with the JDK. You can re-enable these if you need them by modifying the java.security file. In any case, these still appear in the Policy Manager UI even when disabled. We do have a backlog feature for the gateway to do dynamic updates of selectable ciphers in Policy Manager based upon what is enabled and disabled in the JDK. But this is the behavior that the gateway has always exhibited until now. Deprecations, we announced one. We announced that we would be deprecating our support for native TIBCO EMS. We did that because we didn't think we had anybody using it, and so we could remove our burden of maintaining it by deprecating it. We announced that we are deprecating it, but we are not removing it yet. We did plan for 11.1 to be the last major version that it would be supported. And the idea was that, if you still wanted to use TIBCO EMS, you could just do that via, generic JMS. The only thing our support for native TIBCO EMS that offered over generic JMS was that it's the one JMS protocol that supported TLS. However, after making this announcement, we've had at least one customer come back and say, no, they are using TIBCO AMS and they are using it with TLS. So the bottom line is these things go. We probably will continue to keep an eye on that customer. We welcome feedback from any other customers using this so we can keep an eye on you too. And we almost certainly will not remove it as long as those customers are still using it. So I think the last slide here, we can open it up for questions. Upgrade paths. You can do an in-place upgrade to 11.1.2 from either 11.1 GA or the last minor release 11.1.1. If you're not already on 11.1.1, which required you to upgrade the patch management service to version 2.0, in order to upgrade to 11.1.1, then you would need to also upgrade the patch management service to 2.0 first when upgrading from 11.1 GA to 11.1.2. You cannot go from 11.0 anything directly to 11.1.2. You would first need to do an in-place upgrade from 11.0 to 11.1 and then apply the minor release. We made a recent change to our minor releases such that they do require database upgrades just like major releases did before. Even if it's just that we're changing the release version number in the database. And so, you know, it's a new step in the minor release upgrade process that you can perform manually through the SSG config menu. Some customers have automated SSG config with scripting, but we also make it even easier to automate this particular requirement by providing a script that can be executed at the command line. There is a knowledge base article from which you can get that script and documentation on how to use it. Also in minor releases, we are allowing for having to upgrade the gateway platform, which is not to be confused with the operating system platform that comes with appliance gateways or container gateways. This is something we also tried to only do with major releases in the past, but you know, we made both of these changes so that we didn't have some artificial constraints on how we designed and implemented enhancements and new features. In the past, when we tried to avoid, you know, or when we released those things, in the past when we designed and enhanced features or implemented features, we tried to avoid database schema changes. We tried to avoid doing those things that would affect the gateway platform. And so what we ended up doing is coming up with really wonky designs to deliver a feature like that faster, but avoid changing the database schema, or we ended up holding those features back to the next major release. And neither one of those were good situations. So we wanted to remove those arbitrary constraints. It does introduce these new requirements. However, we are allowing you to automate them too. So for most of our customers that automate these processes, not a big deal. I talked about it a little bit earlier. Hardware appliance customers must install latest NCO client provided by us. You can still get that client from us, but we're not automatically, you know, including it, the later version of it, because of the vulnerabilities. Other form factor customers would get it directly from Entrust anyway, and in the future, that's the only way we're going to be supporting that Enshielded client. One thing to note, I think it was called out on a previous slide, but I didn't call it out there myself, is Policy Manager 11.1.2 is not completely backwards compatible. So we never guarantee that Policy Manager will be forward or backwards compatible. We always recommend you use the Policy Manager version that matches the version of the gateway you're connecting to. However, in many cases, Policy Manager has been both backwards and forwards compatible. From a forwards compatibility perspective, an old version of Policy Manager would normally still connect to a newer version of the gateway. You just wouldn't see any of the UI elements introduced in the newer version. You would have to get the right version of Policy Manager, be able to configure those things through the UI. From a backwards compatibility perspective, you would be able to connect to older versions of gateways with the newer versions of Policy Manager. You can still do that with Policy Manager 11.1.2, but there will be errors that will basically crash Policy Manager when you go to open up listener properties or route assertions because of the changes we made to the default cipher sets that can be configured in both places. So just know that. And that is everything we had to present today. So we've got a few minutes left. I can look through the chat now, which I haven't been looking through.
Yeah, don't think I see any questions so far, Ben, in the panel.
Okay.
But let me unmute everyone.
Why don't we do that?
Okay, so everyone's unmuted now, so you can bring yourself off mute and ask a question if you'd like. Or you can type it in, either way. Okay, someone's asking for the slides, Ben. So Ben, they're saying it was a great presentation. I think they just want a copy of the slides. We could potentially create a PDF, right, to send out to folks. Are there any more questions? Ben, are you still there?
Oh, I went on mute and I've been saying.
That's okay. You got some compliments. I think.
Yeah,
not
absolutely.
questions, just everybody saying what a great job you did.
All right. Well, thank you, everybody. But regarding the slides, yes, we can provide the slides. I don't remember if we normally do when we provide a link to the recording that we normally post to the community, but we could also create a PDF of the slides and provide them in that same community post. Pam, I'll make sure you get a PDF of the slides after this.
Yeah, let me do that. All right. Sounds good.
It looks like we might have a question now.
We do. You see it as policy as code. Is it in the new version or is...
Yeah, so policy as code is still a preview feature on top of Graphman, which itself is otherwise GA. There is documentation for the scope of policy as code as preview in the tech docs. It focused on a handful of assertions, you know, that we thought of as big building blocks if customers wanted to use policy as code to create policies from scratch for new APIs. Now, while the existing capability can export policy, you know, existing policies that might have hundreds of assertions, many of which aren't in that short list of assertions that were part of the preview scope. Reliably, what has been missing from that preview release is full validation, documentation of every other assertion and reliably importing all of them back. There are some known issues with importing certain complex assertions today. We are progressing policy as code to support it as preview for all of our assertions before we make it GA in the context of our policy manager replacement project that we've shortened to just calling PM2. I mentioned it earlier in the presentation. I'll say it again now. We are well underway with a project to replace policy manager with a new, more modern web UI that will, you know, replace all of the must-have capabilities of policy manager and introduce a number of enhancements, even as we release it first as experimental, then as preview. We plan to have an experimental release of that in June. We plan to release it as preview with 11.2 in October. You know, the goal right now is to complete all of the assertions and policy as code for them by the preview release in October. I'll say it's a really aggressive goal. We may or may not hit that, but that is the path we are on to completing policy as code. Does that answer your question? Perfect. Thanks, Annika. We got a minute left. Anybody want to come off mute and ask another question or submit one as a question or in the chat? All right.
Okay.
I think
Well, that was perfect.
Thank you, everybody.
Perfect timing. And thank you. Thank you, Ben, for doing this.
Yeah. Thank you, Pam. Thanks, everybody. Have a nice day.